The warning came in the form of a simple transmission sent across secure galactic channels and directed at the Thalzir Dominion's High Command. It was not a threat, not a declaration of war, just a quiet, measured statement from the Galactic Council. Do not provoke the Deathworlders. Conquering Earth is not worth the price you will pay. Supreme Commander Viekaran of the Thalzir Dominion sneered at the message. He leaned back in his throne-like command chair aboard the Warforged Sovereign, the flagship of the invasion fleet, and let out a sharp, guttural laugh. Superstitious cowards, he muttered. These council weaklings tremble before a primitive world. A backwater species that has barely scratched the surface of interstellar flight? Pathetic. His subordinates, officers of noble Thalzir lineage, chuckled in agreement. The Supreme Commander had led a dozen planetary subjugations, crushed rebellion after rebellion, and expanded the Dominion's reach into new territories. This would be no different. Besides, humanity had no real military presence beyond their own solar system. Their technology was decades, if not centuries, behind the Dominion's own advancements. The humans still relied on crude kinetic weapons, inefficient fusion reactors, and chemically propelled missiles. What threat could they possibly pose to an empire that had conquered entire star systems? Yet the warnings persisted. Council representatives, allied warlords, even some Dominion intelligence officers, all spoke in hushed, uneasy tones about what humanity was. Not just an intelligent species. Not just a war-capable race. A Deathworlder. The term itself carried weight among the older civilizations, those that had been part of the stars for thousands of years. A Deathworld was not just any hostile planet, it was a world where nature itself waged war against its own inhabitants. Unpredictable climates. Hyperlethal fauna. Seismic instability. High gravity. Biomes designed to kill. And Earth was one of the worst ever recorded. Still, the Thalzir refused to believe the stories. Creatures that fought for sport? Beings that defied their own biology, pushing themselves beyond their limits just to prove a point. Fabrications. Lies meant to dissuade the weak-minded. Even so, Viekaran had humored the whispers long enough to consult with High Archivist Rel'Thas, one of the few non-Thalzir members within the Dominion's intelligence network. The old scholar had delivered his assessment with something that almost resembled fear. Humans are the only species ever recorded to engage in war among themselves long after achieving planetary dominance. They do not fear death the way other species do. In fact, some of their cultures worship it. They are irrationally tenacious. They do not surrender even when logic demands it. Viekaran had dismissed Rel'Thas with a wave of his clawed hand. He had heard enough. Earth would fall. The invasion begins. The first fleet of the Dominion, carrying over 300 warships and 50,000 soldiers, entered the Sol system without resistance. It was eerily quiet. Viekaran stood on the bridge of his flagship, gazing at the blue-green world below. Pathetic, he scoffed. They don't even have orbital defenses. The Dominion fleet spread out, deploying dropships toward major human cities. No planetary shield. No coordinated defense grid. No fleet to intercept them. This would be a swift, decisive victory. And then, the disappearances began. At first, it was minor. A patrol squad sent into a city lost contact. A scouting drone cut out mid-transmission. But soon, entire platoons vanished without a trace. No wreckage, no distress signals, no bodies. Tension spread like a plague through the Dominion ranks. The humans weren't fighting like any species they had encountered before. There were no grand battle lines, no massed armies waiting to be crushed. The humans were watching. Waiting. When the first Thalzir corpses were discovered, they had been arranged, deliberately positioned in unnatural ways, as if left as a message. And then came the first transmission. Not a plea. Not a demand. Just 4 words, spoken in an eerily calm human voice. You were warned. Cliffhanger. Viekaran clenched his jaw as the transmission ended. Somewhere on that planet, something was watching him. Waiting. And for the first time in his life, Supreme Commander Viekaran felt something he had never known before. Fear. Silence. Not the expected silence of an occupied world, not the hush of surrender, but a silence filled with something unseen, something predatory. Supreme Commander Viekaran stood on the bridge of the Warforged Sovereign, watching the incoming reports from his ground forces. They had landed without resistance, spreading across the major human cities, yet something was wrong. No battles, no desperate last stands, just quiet streets and empty buildings. The humans weren't running. They were waiting. Viekaran's claws tapped against the armrest of his command throne as he scanned the feeds from the ground forces. The Dominion had encountered resistance before, primitive rebels, well-armed planetary militias, even rival galactic powers. But this was different. The first deployments had gone silent within hours. The initial assumption was technical failure, yet the evidence suggested otherwise. The squad simply vanished. Entire patrols wiped from existence. No wreckage, no distress calls. Even the biosign trackers embedded in every soldier ceased transmitting. Worse, when reinforcements arrived to investigate, they too were swallowed by the void. Then the bodies started appearing. Viekaran's personal aide, Lieutenant O.S. Vin, stiffened as he transferred the latest reconnaissance images onto the main display. The Supreme Commander leaned forward, his cold, reptilian eyes narrowing as he examined the scene. Thalzir soldiers, their bodies mutilated in ways that defied battlefield logic. Some had their armor intact, yet their bodies were nothing more than shattered remains within. Others had their weapons melted into slag, as if something had studied their technology and discarded it as useless. But the worst part was the positioning. They were not simply dead. They had been arranged. One squad, pinned to the walls of a ruined human structure, formed a perfect circle, their arms outstretched in unnatural angles, their eyes frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Another group had been placed sitting upright, their bodies eerily intact, helmets removed, expressions twisted into something between agony and madness. At the center of each display of horror was a single, chilling message written in human blood. Prey should not hunt the predator. A cold chill settled over the bridge. No one spoke. Even the veteran officers, those who had waged war for decades, who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer, stood in uneasy silence. Viekaran exhaled slowly. His mind, disciplined and forged through war, pushed away the creeping unease clawing at the edges of his thoughts. This was a strategy, nothing more. Psychological warfare. The humans were attempting to instill fear, to disorient his forces. But it would not work. Deploy the shock battalions, he ordered, his voice a measured growl. Sweep the cities. Root them out. They think they can scare us? They will learn that fear means nothing before the Dominion. Lieutenant O.S. Vin hesitated. Only for a second. But Viekaran saw it. The subtle flicker of doubt, the instinctual hesitation of a seasoned officer who understood, on some level, that they were no longer in control of the battlefield. But orders were orders. The Thalzir shock battalions, their most heavily armored ground units, moved in waves through the human settlements, scanning for resistance. Buildings were breached, drones filled the skies, and scanning pulses swept entire city blocks. Nothing. Then, the ambushes began. They did not come in the form of open attacks, no firefights between opposing forces. Instead, entire squads simply ceased to exist. One moment, a unit would be transmitting standard reports. The next, silence. When reinforcements arrived, all they found were empty helmets, discarded weapons, and the faint traces of human footprints leading back into the shadows. Viekaran listened to the reports with a slow, growing realization. The humans were hunting them. It wasn't war. It wasn't an insurgency. It was something worse. The Dominion's forces had landed, expecting to dominate the battlefield with superior technology and firepower. But the humans were not meeting them in battle. They were letting them advance, letting them stretch their supply lines, letting them believe they were in control. And then, one by one, they were picking them apart. VA Quran had studied countless species, led campaigns against races that thought themselves warriors. But warriors fought battles. Predators hunted. The realization came too late. The first Thalzir warship, stationed in low orbit as an observation post, sent out a distress beacon before all communication was lost. The Sovereign's bridge erupted into chaos as officers scrambled to decipher what had happened. Reports flooded in. Human weapons were nothing special, nothing that should have pierced Dominion defenses. And yet, the warship had been taken. Not destroyed. Not shot down. Taken. By a species that, until now, had been considered too primitive to pose a real threat. VA Quran rose slowly, his claws flexing as something unfamiliar twisted in his chest. His mind screamed for logic, for strategy, for an explanation. But deep in his primal instincts, something ancient, something his species had long forgotten how to feel, began to crawl up his spine. Fear. Then, the next human transmission arrived. A simple video feed. The warship that had gone silent now floated in orbit, empty. Its crew was gone. No signs of forced entry, no atmosphere leaks, no distress calls. It was simply dead, as if it had been drained of all life. And there, standing in the control chamber of the stolen warship, was a single human. A soldier. A woman, clad in worn armor, holding a Dominion officer's severed head in one hand. She stared into the transmission feed, expression unreadable, eyes cold. And then she spoke. "Welcome to the hunt." The first scream over the command network was cut short, replaced by a sharp burst of static. Then another. And another. Within minutes, entire platoons of Thalzir soldiers, some of the Dominion's most elite forces, simply ceased to exist. Supreme Commander VA Quran's claws dug into the armrests of his command throne as he watched the disaster unfold in real time. Holofeeds flickered with broken transmissions, brief flashes of distorted visuals showing the moments before squads went dark, a glimpse of movement, the brief glint of steel, then nothing. This was impossible. The Dominion had crushed entire planetary defense forces, torn apart entrenched civilizations with fleets larger than the one he had brought to Earth. Their firepower was unmatched. Their armor impenetrable. Yet, this war wasn't following any rules he understood. The humans weren't engaging them like soldiers. They weren't defending their cities. They weren't even fighting in a way that could be called war. They were hunting. One of the officers on the bridge of the war-forged Sovereign stepped forward hesitantly. "Supreme Commander, our losses are becoming unsustainable. The enemy does not attack in open engagement. They are." "Where are they?" VA Quran snapped, his voice a razor's edge. "What weapons are they using? Have they deployed armor? Heavy artillery?" The officer hesitated. They are using themselves." The room fell into stunned silence. VA Quran narrowed his eyes. "Explain." The officer swallowed hard, pulling up fragmented combat reports. "They move in small numbers, sometimes alone. No vehicles, no large formations. They do not retreat when injured, they do not surrender. They operate in conditions where our soldiers cannot. Extreme cold, radiation zones, even oxygen-thin environments where they should not be able to fight effectively." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "And they are fast." Another transmission arrived. More footage. More horror. A squad had entered a ruined human city, hunting for resistance fighters. They were professionals, trained in urban combat, armed with the best weapons the Dominion had to offer. Their helmet feeds showed nothing unusual at first, just the eerie emptiness of the city. Then, from the shadows, something moved. A blur of motion. The first soldier was gone before he even had time to scream. The second fired wildly into the darkness, his plasma bolts striking only empty air. The third turned in time to see a pair of human eyes gleaming in the dim light, locked onto him like a predator studying its prey. The footage ended with static. VA Quran forced himself to remain composed. "How many have we lost?" Silence. Then Osvin, his lieutenant, spoke in a hushed tone. 30% of the ground forces. In under a day. A slow dread settled in the commander's gut. That wasn't possible. The Thalzer had fought species that considered themselves warriors before. They had battled hardened mercenary factions, exterminated entire planets of resistance fighters. Even the most desperate species, when outgunned and overwhelmed, eventually broke. But humanity wasn't breaking. They weren't waiting for an opportunity to surrender. They weren't launching last-ditch suicide attacks. They were bleeding the Dominion dry. Another scream broke through the bridge's comm system. A high-ranking field officer this time, his voice frantic, his breathing ragged. They aren't normal. We shot one down, he should be dead. But he got up. Gunfire. A strangled cry. Then silence. The transmission feed flickered, and Viekaran's blood ran cold as he saw the impossible. A human soldier, shot multiple times, bleeding, injured, still standing. Still moving. The man, if he could even be called that, gritted his teeth, his eyes burning with something that no Dominion species had ever seen before. Not desperation. Not fear. Determination. He grinned. And then he lunged at the camera, a blade flashing. The transmission ended. The silence on the bridge of the Warforged Sovereign was suffocating. Viekaran felt something deep in his bones, something he refused to acknowledge. His mind screamed at him that there had to be an explanation, a reason for this madness. But the truth was far simpler. The humans weren't playing by the rules of war. They weren't the ones being invaded anymore. They were hunting the hunters. And, for the first time in his long, brutal career, Supreme Commander Viekaran felt outmatched. Viekaran had always believed in the unshakable supremacy of the Dominion. He had led campaigns against formidable foes, crushed planetary insurrections, and executed strategies so flawless that his name was whispered with reverence and fear. But standing on the bridge of the Warforged Sovereign, watching the latest war reports spill across the holodisplay, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Powerless. The humans were no longer fighting a defensive war. They were on the attack. What had begun as isolated disappearances and psychological warfare had now escalated into something far worse. Entire battalions were being wiped out in coordinated, precision strikes. Dominion supply chains were severed. Ammunition depots detonated before they could be used. Communications were jammed. And the humans were relentless. Viekaran had ordered air superiority. He had deployed hunter-killer drones, orbital bombardments, firestorm sweeps, strategies that had reduced other worlds to ash. Yet somehow, the humans were always one step ahead. They didn't run. They didn't break. They didn't stop. And now, they were striking back. The first sign of the counterattack came in the form of a single stolen Dominion warship, a mid-sized cruiser that had gone dark the day before. Viekaran had assumed it was a casualty of war, another vessel lost in the chaos. Until it returned, as a weapon. It emerged from low orbit, its Dominion IFF codes still intact, slipping past the fleet's defenses without a single shot fired. It approached one of the main Thalzer command ships, the Void's Fury, broadcasting a distress signal. By the time the Dominion realized what was happening, it was already too late. The cruiser's main engines overloaded, its reactor went critical, and in a blinding flash of light, it turned into a fusion bomb, vaporizing the Void's Fury and crippling 3 other capital ships in the process. A human suicide attack? No. Viekaran knew better now. This was calculated. Tactical. Surgical. They had stolen Dominion technology. They had learned how to use it. And then they had weaponized it against them. The humans had not only adapted to the war, they had evolved beyond it. As he stood frozen in thought, another alarm blared. Supreme Commander, an officer shouted. The enemy fleet has arrived. Viekaran turned sharply. Enemy fleet? Impossible. The humans have no fleet large enough to He stopped. The tactical display filled with red markers, indicating incoming ships. Not Dominion warships, but human vessels, hundreds of them. Not pristine battleships, not sleek and powerful dreadnoughts. No, these were something else entirely. Repurposed ships. Cannibalized vessels. A fleet of scavenged, stolen, and modified starships built for one purpose: war. Humanity had never needed a fleet before. But in just days, they had created one. Everything the Thalzer had deployed against them, they had stolen, studied, and repurposed. Dominion railguns now bristled from human battle stations. Alien shielding technology had been torn apart and rebuilt in ways the Dominion had never even considered. And then came the final horror. Human ships weren't engaging in traditional fleet warfare. They were ramming into Dominion vessels at relativistic speeds. Viekaran watched in stunned horror as a single human cruiser, a repurposed cargo hauler reinforced with Dominion armor plating, activated an FTL sling maneuver and crashed into a Dominion dreadnought at near light speed. The explosion ripped apart a quarter of the fleet. The humans had turned their own laws of physics into weapons. This wasn't war. This wasn't a rebellion. This was an extinction event. Viekaran's breath came in short, sharp bursts. The Dominion had invaded Earth with overwhelming force. They had expected a swift, merciless conquest. Instead, they had awakened a nightmare. And now, humanity was making one thing painfully clear. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting to win. The war-forged sovereign trembled under the shockwave of another explosion. The once proud Dominion fleet, an armada that had subjugated entire civilizations, was now a graveyard of twisted metal and burning wreckage. Viekaran's claws gripped the edge of his command throne as he watched the impossible unfold. Humanity wasn't fighting like a desperate species on the brink of annihilation. They weren't scrambling for survival. They were dismantling the Dominion. With precision. With cruelty. With finality. His fleet was in complete disarray. Entire formations had been shattered by human ramming tactics, their ships turned into guided missiles. Every countermeasure the Dominion deployed was anticipated and countered with terrifying efficiency. This was not a species making its first stand against galactic war. This was a species built for war. Supreme Commander, an officer's voice cracked over the bridge noise. Our retreat vectors, they're blocked. Viekaran's eyes snapped toward the holomap. It was true. Somehow, the humans had cut off their escape. The warforged sovereign was no longer the hunter. It was the prey. A transmission cut through the chaos. Unlike the panicked distress calls of the Dominion fleet, this one was calm. Controlled. A human face appeared on the holoscreen. A woman, clad in reinforced armor, standing on the bridge of a captured Dominion warship. The very warship that had been stolen only a day prior. Viekaran knew instantly she was their leader. Or at least, one of them. The humans had no centralized ruling warlords like the Thalzer. They didn't need them. They had something worse. They had individuals willing to lead the charge. The human woman spoke. Not with anger. Not with desperation. With cold, calculated finality. The Thalzer Dominion is over. The bridge fell silent. Every officer, every Dominion soldier still alive, stared at the screen, transfixed. This was not a war, she continued. This was a mistake. Your mistake. You came to our world believing we were prey. You ignored every warning, every caution, every plea from those who understood what you were dealing with. Her eyes, cold and steady, locked onto Viekaran. And now, the price is being paid in full. Viekaran felt his throat tighten. This was wrong. This was not how it was supposed to go. The Dominion had never lost like this before. Your fleet is broken, the human said. Your soldiers are gone. Your empire will not survive what comes next. And we will not be merciful. Another explosion rocked the warforged sovereign. The humans weren't waiting for negotiations. They had made their decision. This was extermination. Viekaran forced himself to his feet. His mind screamed for solutions, for a way to turn this around. There had to be a way. There had to be. A second transmission came through. This one wasn't from the humans. It was from the Galactic Council. The holoscreen flickered again, revealing the weary, aged face of Council Speaker Hiran Vo. His expression was not one of surprise. Not even of horror. Only resignation. Supreme Commander Viekaran, the speaker said. The Thalzir Dominion has been declared an outlaw state by the Galactic Council. Silence. The words didn't make sense. Effective immediately, all remaining Thalzir forces are to be isolated and abandoned. Any attempt at retreat will be met with full military response from the Unified Galactic Coalition. Viekaran's blood turned to ice. This was betrayal. This council has seen what you have unleashed, the speaker continued, his voice heavy. The warnings were given. The signs were clear. And yet, you did not listen. Now, we will not risk our own extinction for your arrogance. The line cut out. Viekaran's claws trembled as the reality of the situation set in. The entire galaxy had just turned its back on the Dominion. Not out of hatred. Out of fear. Another explosion tore through the hull. Fire alarms blared. A dozen officers shouted at once, but Viekaran heard none of it. The Dominion was gone. Everything he had built, every campaign he had waged, every world he had conquered, it was all ash. And at the center of it all stood humanity. The last thing he saw before the final explosion consumed the Warforged Sovereign was the human fleet advancing without hesitation. And he understood. The war had never been about conquest. It had been a warning. A warning that no one had listened to. Until now. The Dominion was gone. Not merely defeated and erased. The once great Thalzir Empire, an expansionist force that had ruled the stars for centuries, now existed only as scattered debris in orbit over Earth. Their fleets, once symbols of galactic supremacy, had been annihilated. Their worlds, once untouchable strongholds, now lay silent, abandoned by allies too terrified to intervene. And at the center of it all, standing atop the ruins of their would-be conquerors, was humanity. The final Dominion transmission had gone out hours ago, a desperate plea for reinforcements that had gone unanswered. The Galactic Council had sealed their fate, not because of some moral outrage, not because they had suddenly grown a conscience. No. They had abandoned the Thalzir because they feared what humanity would do if they didn't. Earth's retaliation had not been a show of force. It had been a demonstration. A message carved into the wreckage of Dominion warships, burned into the hushed whispers of every surviving alien who had watched it unfold. Humanity is not to be provoked. On the bridge of the captured Thalzir dreadnought, now fully under human control, Commander Helen Voss stood motionless, watching the ruins of the last Dominion capital ship drift into the abyss. The war was over. But the consequences had only just begun. A quiet beat broke her from her thoughts. A transmission, not from Earth, but from the Galactic Council itself. She exhaled, bracing herself, before accepting the call. Speaker Hiran Vo appeared on the holoscreen, his reptilian features drawn and tired. There was no condemnation in his eyes. No accusations, no demands for restraint. Only acceptance. You have reshaped the balance of the galaxy, Commander Voss, the speaker said. And now, we must decide what happens next. Helen studied him for a moment before responding. There's nothing to decide, Speaker. Earth was attacked. We ended the threat. That's all this ever was. The speaker's nostrils flared slightly. You and I both know that is no longer the truth. The Thalzir are finished, but fear of your species will not end here. Many among the Council see you as a force that must be contained. Helen gave a bitter chuckle. Good luck with that. A tense silence followed. It was the truth, and they both knew it. No one could contain Earth now. The humans had not just survived an interstellar war. They had won it against impossible odds. And now, the rest of the galaxy understood something horrifying. Humanity was no longer an isolated species clinging to its homeworld. They were a galactic power. Earth has a choice, the speaker continued. It can either embrace diplomacy and integrate itself into the wider galactic community, or... His voice grew quieter. Or it can become something else. Something far worse. Helen let the words settle. She knew the weight of what he was implying. Humanity had proven its strength, but the galaxy was watching, waiting to see what they would become. For centuries, Earth had been an afterthought, a footnote in the grand history of the cosmos. But now, they were the species everyone feared. Finally, Helen nodded. Earth never wanted this war. But if anyone thinks they can control us after this, they're fools. We won't seek war, Speaker. But we won't fear it either. The speaker's expression darkened. I expected as much. Another silence stretched between them before Helen spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of everything that had been lost, everything that had been won. The Thalzer ignored the warnings. They refused to listen. She met his gaze, unflinching. Make sure no one else makes the same mistake. The transmission cut out. Helen turned to her crew. Around her, former Dominion warships now bore human markings. Captured technology had been integrated into Earth's growing fleet. A fleet that would ensure this would never happen again. Humanity had never been the aggressor. They had never sought expansion, never desired conquest. But now, after everything, they understood the game the galaxy was playing. And they would never be caught unprepared again. A final message was transmitted from Earth to every remaining power in the galaxy. A warning. We do not start wars. But we will end them. The galaxy held its breath. And for the first time in history, the stars feared the children of Earth.